You're listening to the Good Food CFO podcast. I am your host, Sarah Delavan, and with us, as always, is our producer, Chelsea Steer. Hey, Chels.
Hey, Sarah, we are, or you, I really should say, are answering another listener question today.
Yeah, this episode actually comes as a result of two people asking questions around the same topic. So we decided to devote an entire episode to answering their questions.
Yeah, but Sarah, before we get into that, we have a new Baba Yacht member to shout out here on the podcast. Our new Baba Yacht member is Amber Stevenson of Rosebuds Real Food. Rosebuds makes organic seasoning mixes and gluten-free baking mixes to make your mealtime simple, nutritious, and delicious. And they have been in business for almost 12 years now. She says that they are still growing, evolving, and working hard to streamline their processes and understand their numbers. I think that's part of why they decided to become a Baba Yacht member, but they have been working to increase their wholesale, and they're also being asked to act as a co-packer.
Very cool.
So I thought that was really cool. If you want to learn more about Rosebuds Real Food, you can visit www.rosebudsrealfood.com.
We'll, of course, put that link in the show notes as well. I want to say a big public thank you to you, Amber, and to Rosebuds. I'm looking forward to meeting you at one of our upcoming Baba Yacht events. Thank you so much for being a part of our community.
Yeah. Okay, so as we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we are answering some questions around actually a recent episode that we did last season.
Yep.
The episode was where you were breaking down like the 5 reports or like essential reports that you think every founder should be kind of checking in with and the order in which to do so, right? To add them into your routine. And at the end of the episode, you were talking about the balance sheet.
Yep.
And when we talked about the balance sheet, you mentioned inventory turnover ratio. And I think in the episode itself, you might have given like a pretty short, like this is how you get your inventory turnover ratio, but we didn't spend a lot of time on it. And then shortly after that episode aired, we heard from multiple people who were like, how do I find my inventory turnover ratio?
Yeah. And like, what does it tell us about our business? And I thought it was really interesting. And to be honest, I was like, they're listening to the entire episode and they've, made it to that last report, like on the list, and they have questions. I was very excited about that because like, to be honest, they're all important, right? We were, like, as you said, kind of ranking order of importance for which founders like should be paying attention to certain reports. And so it was exciting to get questions on such a like small part of the episode and this like very specific ratio that we were talking about. And it is a valuable ratio for many brands. And I was excited to dig into answering their questions.
Yeah. And I think that, I felt like you did a very good job of, and as people will hear in the episode, really separating like who should be looking at inventory turnover ratio, who should be looking at something else, how do you differentiate, and then what those numbers actually tell you about your business.
Yeah. When you look at a ratio, like a financial ratio, we don't talk about them a lot here. They're kind of weird to interpret, right? Like you get an answer is like 3.2. You're like, okay, well, what do I do with that? So we talk through like, what do you do with that? How do you convert it into a metric that has like some actual meaning? And then what do you do with that metric and how do you assess what it means for your business? Because Chelsea, as we say so often, every business is unique. So if one company, gets a 3.2 and another company gets a 3.2, it's not inherently good or bad and is going to mean different things for each of those businesses based on some specifics. So we also dive into like how to interpret, that ratio, how to utilize it, and whether or not, as you kind of hinted at, you need to be looking at this number as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Sarah, I think we're going to take a short break here, but then I'm ready to dive in.
Yeah, let's do it. Hey there, it's Sarah. If you're enjoying the podcast, I want to invite you to become a Baba Yacht member. It stands for Building a Business on Your Own Terms. And your membership directly supports the continued production of this podcast and helps us reach our goal of supporting 1 million food founders. As a member, you'll get access to our live coaching events, have your brand featured right here on the podcast, be the first to test our new tools, and receive a 10% discount on all of our tools and services when you choose an annual plan. Join fellow successful founders at thegoodfoodcfo.com/babayat. That's spelled BABOYOT. Together, we're changing the way that food business is done. Now, back to the show.
So, Sarah, we are back again with another listener question episode today, as I mentioned in the intro. And this episode is really about like one question that was asked a couple of different ways. So I'm going to just quickly cover the two questions that we got for this episode, and then I cannot wait to jump right in. The first person that wrote in about this particular topic was our very good friend Danielle, and she said very succinctly, "How do you calculate inventory turnover ratio at the Good Food CFO?" And then we had another question. This was actually a comment on Spotify. It was exciting to see comments starting to come in on Spotify. And this one is from Trisha. She said, "Can you further explain what inventory turnover is at a very high level? Like, what does turnover mean? Are you referencing the total amount of inventory that's sitting on your shelf at the end of the year? I know that you said average, but in what time period are you looking at to find that average?"
Yeah, really good questions.
Yeah, so I am excited to hear what I'm sure will be your very thoughtful answer, and then to continue to ask you more questions when I don't understand. So let's jump into it.
Okay. So I'm going to start with the time frame element here.
Mm-hmm.
So you can calculate your inventory turnover ratio for any time frame that you choose, but typically it's done for 1 year. But you could also look at it, for example, for a 6-month time frame. So let's say we're going to look at our inventory turnover ratio for 1 year. When we talk about the average, what we're like the average inventory, which is part of the formula, we're looking at essentially the starting inventory for that year. So that is number of units on shelf at the beginning of the year. And then we're going to also look at the number of units on shelf at the end of the year. We're going to add those two numbers together and divide by 2 to get an average inventory value.
Okay.
If you were doing that for a 6-month time frame, you would simply have your inventory on hand at the start of the 6-month time frame that you're looking at. So let's just say it's January through the end of June. Is that 6 months? You would have the starting inventory as of January 1 and the quote unquote ending inventory as of the end of June. You would add those two numbers together and divide by 2. And the reason that this is done is to primarily smooth out any like seasonality or anything, especially if you're doing it in a time frame that's not 1 full year, right? So if you're doing it for 6 months and you have a peak season within that 6-month time frame, taking the average is a good thing to do.
Yeah, that was going to be my question, is if you are a seasonal business and you were looking at it, like, would you want to look at it more closely than over an entire year if you do have times of the year where maybe you have way more inventory on hand because of the seasonality of your business versus maybe other times of the year where, you know, your sales just are not as high and you don't have, or maybe you do have more inventory because your sales are not that high.
Right. Yeah, I think depending on, like, as we move through this episode and we kind of dig into the answers to the questions that were posed, what my hope is that you'll identify how often you should be looking at your inventory turnover ratio. And if it's, let's say, a metric that you need to quote unquote improve on, you might want to look at it at a 6-month like time frame rather than waiting for a full year.
Got
right?
it.
Because it can be helpful to you to go, okay, am I on the right track? You're not going to make a lot of moves in a month or possibly even 3 months when it comes to like moving inventory, but 6 months you can potentially have an impact. And over the course of a year, if you need to make changes or, like I said, improvements, if you will, you should start seeing them
Yeah.
over that year.
Okay.
So the next question, like around like what does turnover mean, right? Turnover is essentially another word for sold through. So inventory turnover ratio shows us how many times your company purchased inventory and then sold through it in a given time frame, right? And today we're going to use a year primarily. So instead of saying inventory turnover ratio, you might say, let's calculate how many times we sold through our inventory this year. It's the same thing. So that makes sense, Charles?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the ratio that you calculate, and this is really important for your business, is going to be relative, right? This is like another way of me saying it depends, right? Because you could calculate your inventory turnover ratio and benchmark it against someone else in the industry or an entire like segment of the industry. But I'm going to recommend that as an emerging good food brand, you track it over time for your business to understand what it means for you and your cash flow and your cash management, right? Your overall strategy. And we're going to dive into that a bit more later, but I don't really want you to be comparing this to an industry benchmark.
Others.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I completely understand what you're saying. And I think that that's a really good call out, especially for emerging brands to really start to gather their own data
Yeah.
about what's going on in their business. I love that.
Yeah. Here's another actually extremely important thing we need to talk about before we go further into these calculations. And that is that the inventory turnover ratio, that formula specifically, is intended for brands that are using accrual based accounting. Okay.
Mm,
If you're using cash based accounting, which I know many like new and sort of like we'll use that word emerging brands are using, there's a different formula for you. So hang through, like stay with us if you're a cash based accounting company, because I still think there are things you can learn from the conversation. But then I'm going to give you the formula that you should use as a cash based business to learn something about your essentially your inventory turnover ratio.
okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the reason, kind of diving into that more, the reason I'm making that distinction is because the inventory turnover ratio requires a cost of goods sold number that is the actual cost of goods that a business has sold. And that number will be found on the P&L for companies using accrual-based accounting. For a
Mm-hmm.
cash-based business, you're going to see all of the cost of goods sold and the cost of your inventory on the P&L, right? Because
Yeah.
it's based on essentially when you spend, let's say $25,000 to purchase new inventory, it all is going onto your P&L as a cash-based business. 25K spent in the month of March, right? As opposed to an accrual-based business that is potentially still spending that $25,000, but that's all going to go into an inventory asset account on the balance
Balance
sheet.
sheet.
And then as the product is sold, the cost of goods sold is going to move over to the P&L. Make
Okay,
sense?
that makes sense. Yeah. And it
Okay.
also makes sense as to how this whole conversation started in the first place, talking about the balance sheet.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So I'm an accrual based business. I have my fresh P&L from the month of May printed out, ready to go. I'm looking at those COGS, those like actual costs of what was sold.
Mm-hmm.
How do I take that number? Like, what's the formula here to start to look at that inventory turnover?
Yeah. So we're going to walk through this in 3 steps. We're going to talk through the first 2 steps, and then we're going to take that outcome and walk through the third step, essentially.
Okay.
Right. So the first thing we're going to do is calculate that average inventory value that we talked about a couple of minutes ago. So if you are at the end of May and you're doing a 6-month, or I'm going to say a year, right? Because we're just going to stick with that year time frame. You're going to go to 12 months prior and you're going to look at what was my inventory value at that point, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that you will find on your balance sheet. So go to your balance sheet and pull that inventory value. And then you're going to look at your balance sheet for the end of May and pull that inventory asset value. And you're going to add those 2 numbers together and divide by 2. Now you've got your average inventory value. So that's step 1.
Okay.
The next thing you're going to do is calculate the inventory turnover ratio. And so that's going to be the cost of goods sold for that same time frame divided by that average inventory value that you just calculated. So you're going to run your P&L for the full year, right? So it's going to be essentially June 1st of the prior year through the end of May of the current year to give you a full 12-month P&L. And you're going to take that total cost of goods sold for that period and divide it by the average inventory value. We've got some numbers. So if you're someone who likes to kind of jot things down, to sort of take it in, maybe grab a pencil or something, and jot this down. So the sample company we're using today has cost of goods sold for the period of $990,000. And their inventory value for that time frame, the average inventory value is $360,000. Okay. So when we do that math, the ratio we get is 2.75. And to be quite honest, that number doesn't mean much. So let's go to that final third step, which is going to put this number into some context for us. So we're looking at a 1-year period, which is 365 days. We're going to take 365, divide by 275, and the answer we get there is 146. And this is where we get helpful information. 146 is the number of days it takes this company to sell through their inventory. Right? If we take 146 and we divide by, let's just say 30 to get like a rough monthly average, another way to look at this is to say it takes 4.86 months to sell through inventory. Okay. So let's just walk through this one more time. So we have our product COGS for the time frame, $990,000. We have our average inventory value, which is $360,000. Okay. We take those COGS, we divide it by the average inventory value, we get the number 2.75. Because we're looking at a full year, we're going to then take 365 and divide by 2.75. And our result is 146. 146 is essentially the number of days it takes for us or this company to sell through an inventory purchase or sell through its inventory. If we take that 146 and we divide by 30, we get 4.86, and that's roughly the number of months it takes to sell through inventory.
Okay, so I just want to run through very quickly one more time where we got all this information. So those product COGS, you said we're pulling from our P&L. So we're pulling a P&L for a full 12 months. That's where we're getting that number.
Yep.
Then the average inventory value, that was from the 2 inventory values that we pulled from our balance sheet.
Correct.
And that's where we got that number. That turned into when we did the math, 2.75 for our inventory turnover ratio. And then the 365 that we're dividing, that just comes from the calendar because we're looking at a whole year. And then that's where you got the 146 when you did that math. And then dividing by the 30 days, as you said, in the month, put us at 4.86 months.
Yes. So for context, if you're going to do this for a 6-month time frame, you won't use 365, right? You'll figure out how many days are in 6 months, right? In an average 6 months. And then that's the number you would use in place of the 365, right? So you're going to adjust it a little bit based on the time frame that you're using. And so this is a number, this 146 days or these 4.86 months, this is a number that is telling us a story. Right. But I'm sure, Chelsea, you can hear our audience in the distance saying, what does it mean? Is that good or is it bad? Right. Yeah. And the answer, of course, to that is, it depends. It depends. But let me give you some context that will help the it depends make a little bit more sense. Right. So generally speaking, the higher the inventory turnover ratio, the faster you're selling through and, quote, turning over your inventory.
Okay.
Right? Because let's say, for example, the ratio was 5 instead of 2.75. We'd be dividing 365 by 5. The result would be smaller than 146. And so the time frame in which we're selling through our inventory would be shorter. Right?
Yeah.
And the lower the number, the slower you are turning over your inventory. right? And again, whether that is good or bad depends on the specifics of your business. And I think one of the most important things to think about here is, what is the lead time for you to get new product? If it takes 2 months from the time you place an order to the time that you receive your order, having, you know, an extra 2 months of inventory on hand, or having 2x the inventory that you know need on hand, is not a bad thing, right? Versus if you are making your own inventory in-house and you've got 4 months of it lined up, but there's not a long lag time for you to get your ingredients or for you to get your packaging, then 4.86 months might be a bit too long, like for your specific business, right? You also want to think about what your expected growth is.
Yeah.
If you're running, like, over the last year 4.86 months of inventory on hand, but you're about to double your sales because you're launching into a new channel or you're moving into regional distribution or something like that, right? That inventory turnover rate is about to drop. And you need to have a decent amount of inventory on hand to support that growth, right? The other thing you might want to think about is, how perishable are your goods? If you've got a 6-month shelf life and stuff is sitting on your shelves for 4 months, almost 5, this is not a good ratio for you specifically. And then I'd say the last thing you want to think about, at least, for the sake of this episode, is your cash runway. If you have a short lead time to get your ingredients and your packaging right, and to get new product on your shelf, and you've got a nearly 5 months worth of inventory, on as your, inventory turnover ratio, but your cash flow is a little tight, or you could use some extra cash to execute, maybe a marketing strategy or something. Maybe you want to adjust and, get your turnover ratio down to like 3.5.
Yeah.
Right. Or even 3 or something less, right? Because then that puts more cash in your bank account and less cash tied up in inventory.
Yeah. And I feel like I always point this out when we talk about inventory too, is like, where are you storing that inventory? And is that costing you anything?
Yeah. Yeah. I think too, something else we should talk about is, like, when you do this ratio, it's looking at all of your inventory, right? If you have more than one product, or if you have multiple SKUs, there is something to be said about looking into which products are sitting in inventory the longest, right? Is there a particular product that is, influencing that ratio or the number of days in inventory? Or is this like all of your products that are sort of moving at the same rate, right? I know that I've talked, this was a while ago now, but about a meat business where we realized that they had a lot of chicken in stock. They were moving very quickly through their primary products, which was like beef, right? But analyzing their inventory revealed that they were sitting on months worth of chicken inventory. Like, they had 8+ months of inventory, in the freezer with a scheduled repurchase coming up. And so it was like, no, we're going to cancel that order and we're going to run some promos on chicken, because they were paying, as you just pointed out, for storage. Like, they had to keep that chicken in the freezer. So they're paying rent essentially. So they had not only had an increased rent expense for the amount of chicken that they were storing, but they also had a lot of cash tied up in that chicken inventory.
Yeah.
Right. So that's like, and the sales numbers were amazing. They were growing very quickly in terms of revenue. And so like, you wouldn't necessarily think, oh, I wonder if there's an inventory issue here. I wonder what our inventory turnover ratio is. We decided to look into it as the finance team because the cash flow wasn't flowing the way that it should have, based on the revenue, based on how that beef inventory was moving. It was like, something is up. And so in that instance where you're like, what is going on? We ran a number of ratios, and that's where we found out something's going on with inventory. What exactly is it? In this specific case, they also happened to have a lot of bones in inventory. So
Mm-hmm.
we found a couple of things. But then it became a strategy for let's get rid of this stuff because it's actually going to save us money.
I actually love this conversation because I love that you're pointing out that like here was a business who's showing really strong growth,
Mm-hmm.
high revenue, everything, on paper looks like it should be going good, but then there was a disconnect when it came to their cash. And
Yeah.
so like having this in your back pocket of, well, hang on, let me go and check my inventory ratio. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
that is like just having that extra layer of digging in and understanding what's really happening in your business.
Yeah. And I think, this is also a good point to bring up. I talked through what reports to pay attention to, right? And I gave an order, right? And cash flow was at the tippy top of that list. And if you're monitoring your cash flow, you're projecting your cash flow, and you don't understand why your cash flow doesn't look how you think it should, digging into the other reports can be beneficial
Yeah.
to you, right? We use the profit assessment a lot to look at the business holistically and say, what could it be that is creating this financial outcome beyond the P&L, right? In our business. And oftentimes I think we've talked about it before here, Chelsea, we've got that decision tree, right?
Yeah.
There's a point on that decision tree where it says, okay, if your margins on your products are good, right? But you've still got like something funny happening, go check your inventory.
Mm-hmm.
Go see how long you're holding onto inventory for. There are businesses, especially emerging brands, people who are just launching, people who are working toward that first $1 million in revenue. They have gigantic orders. They've got, if you're working with a co-packer in particular, right? You've got big orders because there might be an MOQ, meaning minimum order quantity that you are locked into.
Yeah.
You might have to purchase big quantities of packaging, right? In order to be able to place the order or in order to save a couple of cents per unit. But if and so we've sort of been talking about finished goods essentially, but let's just talk about another type of inventory, which is simply packaging inventory. You
Yeah.
might have empty bags, empty boxes, empty tins, empty jars, whatever your packaging is, sitting on your shelf in the warehouse. You might have a year's worth, right, of that packaging inventory. You might have 2 years worth of that. That is going to impact that turnover ratio. That is absolutely going to have an impact on your cash flow, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you've essentially every unit that's sitting in your inventory that is not selling or not sellable like within the next 30 days, that's like picture it as dollar
Money.
signs
Yeah. Tied up money.
sitting. I can't do
Yeah.
anything with that until I sell it. So the shorter amount of time it lives on your shelf, the quicker you can turn it into cash and into hopefully a gross profit margin above 50%, when you sell that product. So it's very beneficial to sell goods, right? And it's less beneficial to have, whether it's finished product, ingredient inventory, packaging inventory, sitting on your shelf for too long. Again, you got to take into account, how long does it take me to get this packaging? How long does it take me to
Yeah.
get my finished product? What is a safe amount of time or safe amount of inventory to have so that I don't run out, because we don't want that to happen either, right? But so that I'm not sitting on this for an extended period of time and tying up my cash.
Yeah, it seems like again, right? It depends. It's
Mm-hmm.
nuanced. It's very much based on your business and the levers within your business, right? But I
Yeah.
think that it's such a good call out to look at it and really understand like what does my lead time need to be? How much inventory do I really need to have on hand? And when you can dig in and answer those questions for yourself, then the information that you can get from calculating your inventory turnover becomes that much more useful.
Yeah. And earlier in the episode today, right, we talked about your ratio not necessarily needing to be compared to someone else in the industry or to an industry standard, right? But to be compared just over time within your business. So let's say that you start out with a 5-month, number, right? So it's taking you 5 months to sell through your inventory, and you determine that that's longer than it needs to be for you, right? Then you can start to take whatever the steps look like to reduce that inventory, in reduce the amount of units, I guess I should say, you have in your inventory, modify your ordering habits, your ordering timeframes, etc., and then check back in 6 months, and you might not see a huge change, but then again in like over a year, and you want to start seeing a change. You want to start seeing that 2.75 going up, eking up to 3, eking up to 3.25, right? You want to see that changing. And it's not that you necessarily want to see the inventory value in terms of dollars going down, because if your sales are going up, right? If your revenue is increasing, you're selling more product, you might actually have a higher inventory value in terms of dollars. And that's why we're looking at the ratio. So you want the ratio to go up. You don't necessarily want the inventory value in dollars to go down.
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah, that's a very good call out. So, okay, I'm really understanding now the value of this ratio and why we would want to look into this, but I want to get back to something you said earlier, which was you were talking about cash-based businesses and how things differ for cash-based businesses. And I'm very curious how you would use something like an inventory turnover ratio in that sense, because the way that you're collecting the data in that business is going to be so different.
Yeah. Number one, and let's just kind of go over this again, the cost of goods sold that is showing on your P&L is really going to encompass every penny you've spent for product, packaging, etc., even if it's still sitting on the shelf technically as inventory, right? So we can't use the COGS number. So in place of the COGS number, we're going to actually use a revenue number. Okay. Additionally, though, because you're not an accrual-based business, you're not going to have an inventory asset account on your balance sheet. That doesn't exist for cash-based businesses. So for you to gather your average inventory value, you will have had to do a physical inventory count. Now, accrual-based businesses also should be doing physical inventory counts at least once a year, but this is going to be a requirement to have a number to work with. And as a reminder, when we have inventory, it is valued at the cost of that inventory, meaning let's say your finished product cost you $5, but you sell it for $12. The value of that inventory is $5. It's not $12. Okay.
I gotcha.
So you're going to want to do a physical count of your inventory, at that start point. And then whatever the end point is for the time frame you're looking at, you want to do an inventory count there as well. Determine the value, the cost value of that inventory, and sort out the average. Same way, right? Beginning plus ending divided by 2.
Okay.
And then again, you're going to take your sales number instead of your cost of goods sold number.
Okay.
And then the formula in this case is going to be your average inventory value divided by sales.
Okay. So that's going to look a little different.
It's quite literally the inverse, right? The formula is the inverse. And the number that the ratio is going to spit out is going to look very different. So what I did to try to have some continuity here was I took the original set of numbers that we are working with, and I made an assumption that this company has a 50% product margin. So from that $990,000 of cost of goods sold, they would generate $1,980,000 in revenue. Okay. And then we kept that same $360,000 in average inventory value. Okay. So when we were using the inventory turnover ratio, we got 2.75. And when we're using this new inventory to sales ratio, as it is called, our output is 0.18. So as you can see, those numbers are very different.
Yeah.
When using this ratio, a higher inventory to sales ratio suggests that your company might be holding on to excess inventory relative to its sales volume, meaning you're not turning over your inventory very efficiently. And the lower the inventory to sales ratio implies that the company has a lean, like inventory management style, right? And perhaps a tighter control over their inventory levels, period, right?
Okay, so this is we're basically talking about the opposite
Exactly.
of our inventory turnover ratio. Okay.
Exactly. So going back to the numbers we have here, the inventory to sales ratio that we have calculated is 0.18. And now, one way that this could be viewed is that for every dollar in sales that you generate, you have basically 18 cents of inventory. Okay. Again, this could be like, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a little bit more clear here than it
Yeah.
is in the inventory turnover ratio. Because let's start with if the result of this formula was a 1, right?
Yes.
That would mean that for every dollar in sales that you have a dollar like worth of inventory value, worth of inventory on hand.
Yeah. And I'm thinking that inventory value on hand is the cost, not the sales price. So having those equal doesn't seem.
Yeah. We can't say that it is the cost, but it's a good way to frame it in your mind.
Okay.
Okay. If the output of this inventory to sales ratio was, for example, 1.25, that would mean that for every dollar in revenue that you are generating, you actually have $1.25 like in inventory on
Yeah.
hand. Like that's not great. That means that we've got a lot more inventory on hand than what we're able to sell, let's say, in this year, right? So basically, we want this number to be as low as possible, as far away from 1 as possible to a certain extent, right? For your business, 0.18 might be perfect. Again, we're using essentially the same numbers as we did in the first example. So
Mm-hmm.
0.18 might, when you first do it, you might be like, I don't know what this number means for me, right? But if you then take into consideration that your cash is tight, or you're also monitoring how long it takes you to move through a certain, lot of product or something like that, you can discern then, 0.18 might be too high for me. Maybe I
Mm-hmm.
could get away with a slightly lower, inventory to sales ratio. And so you might make some adjustments. I personally think that this number is a little bit harder to work with than the
Yeah.
inventory turnover ratio.
Yeah, because I think in the inventory turnover ratio, at the end of it, you're looking at like actual time,
Yeah.
which I think gives you a lot more clarity.
Yeah. Agreed. But for I know that Danielle, at least the last time we spoke, she was a cash-based business in terms of how she was doing her bookkeeping. So it felt really important to bring this here, to have a formula for a cash-based business and to talk about, okay, what could this mean? But I do think it's harder to interpret because we can't really turn this into days.
Yeah, and I think for this cash-based formula, at least the way I'm looking at it, is like the first time that you do it, it's probably not going to mean anything to you,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's
Yeah.
really going to be on you to, as you said, do that monitoring over time and
Yep.
then decide really what that target should be, or if you need to move in one direction or the other
Yeah.
here. So it's going to be a lot more like on the founder.
Yeah, I think if I was consulting for this particular brand, right, I would say let's look at our inventory values on a monthly basis,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or maybe I would say let's do a COGS calculation based on what we're actually selling on a monthly basis. I would want another way to track the physical inventory movement through the company. And to essentially associate this 0.18 to an actual physical thing,
Yeah.
right? Now, if you're listening and you're like, Sarah, if you don't love this ratio, then why are you
Why share
talking
it?
about it?
Yeah.
Because I think that it's there's that saying, is the juice worth the squeeze? It might not be worth the squeeze to do this particular ratio. The ratio calculation takes 2 seconds, right? It's the inventory counting that's going to take time. I do like an inventory count. I want to know how product is moving at the end of every month. Does that take a long time? Can it be a pain in the butt? Yes. Can it provide you with valuable information? Yes.
Yeah.
So I suppose the answer to that question is I think there is value in knowing how your inventory is moving through your company, how it's moving through the business. And if you're a cash-based business, that means doing a physical inventory count from time to time.
Yeah.
Paying attention to and keeping track of, like, when are you purchasing? How is that affecting your inventory? How quickly are things, moving and changing? What are your highest selling products? That's just having a hand on what is happening in your business. You as a founder can utilize this ratio to communicate to other people, this one and the inventory turnover ratio. But you yourself can be doing other things, like physically within the business, to have your finger on the pulse of what
Yeah.
this is, right? Really, ratios are for communicating to other people. Like, if you're communicating to a potential funder, like no matter who that funder is, potential investor, right? A coach, how your inventory is moving, the quickest way to do it is with a ratio,
Yeah.
and a conversation about how that ratio is changing over time. But inside your business, you don't necessarily need to be talking about ratios, right? You're going to be talking about how quickly is this product moving?
Yeah.
And what is our schedule for bringing in new product and why, right? It's the strategy behind it. If your potential funder, investor, coach wants to know those details of why is that ratio changing and is this a good thing or a bad thing, then you can kind of dig into it. But I really think that these are for communicating. Again, when I did this math for that protein business, I'm not physically with the inventory. We can't get a physical inventory count of everything because it was spread out over the country. So the ratio helped us figure out that we needed to dig in further. So it's also helpful, but that's as a non-founder in the business wanting to get a handle on things. So, again, we don't want to overcomplicate things, right? We need good data. We need to understand how things are moving through our business. These ratios can help. They can help us track changes over time. They can help us to communicate. But if you are not calculating these inventories or these inventory ratios, that is totally fine.
Yeah. And I love that we got these questions, in the inbox and in our comments, because it is very clear that people are interested, that they are looking into this, that they want to understand how to understand, right? To get a better handle on their business.
Yeah.
And so that means that they want to do the work. So I think that's like a number one, a positive thing.
Totally.
I think digging into how to do it is like so great. But I think that, your advice here of like, what is it really about? What are you really trying to understand? And how are you understanding that in your business is so important.
Yeah. I'll add one more thing. I think that if you are a founder that has a team, right? I know I work with some founders that have brokers. They, might have like a lead salesperson, and they are working with them. They're forecasting, being onboarded with new retail stores, for example, and then they're also trying to figure out how much inventory do we have and how much product should we produce and what should we buy. Communicating again across a team, so not just for investors or funding, but communicating across a team, the ratio could be helpful there as well, right? To tell a story and to make sure that the sales team isn't selling too quickly. The brokers aren't onboarding, too quickly for what we're able to do with our inventory. Maybe we want to have consistently a 3 for our inventory turnover ratio. So it might be something that we can monitor and communicate to the team. We need to pull back if our turnover ratio has gotten really high and we're running the risk of running out of products and we want to service our current accounts, right? So I don't want to imply that it's not valuable at all. I just think that there are certain times and places where the actual calculation of these numbers makes sense. Otherwise, the awareness of how is my inventory changing, like on like a hands-on level can often be enough. So do
Yeah.
what is right for you, your team, what you're striving for, and what you want to understand and how you like to think about your business. I think at the end of the day, and we're talking about Bobby Yachts, it's what it's all about.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, Sarah, thank you for diving into this topic with us.
My pleasure.
And I want to thank Danielle and Trisha for sending us these questions and giving us the opportunity to, dig in.
Yeah. Thanks, ladies. Have a great day.
Looking for more content like this? Subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll see weekly podcast episodes as well as other content related to the show. Just visit youtube.com/@thegoodfoodcfo.
Thank you for joining us here today. If you enjoyed this episode or found it helpful or inspiring in any way, please share it with your founder friends on social and rate and review the podcast wherever you listen. It's the #1 way to help good food founders find the show. We'll be back with a brand new episode next week.